that's where we feel the market has overshot a bit. If we take the Treasury yield curve, you're talking earlier about Treasury yields, the front end of that yield curve was implying last week, hikes starting in late 2022 and multiple hikes in 2023. That feels too aggressive to us. The Fed hasn't even begun tapering, hasn't even really talked about beginning tapering. We think that would happen at the beginning of 2022 or at the earliest at late 2021 and take a year before we would even have rate hikes on the table. So we think there has been a little bit of an overshoot at the front end, but in medium to long-term yields, global growth is looking better. There is large-scale stimulus still working its way through the system, particularly in the U.S., more to come. So we wouldn't push back so much against the yield curve moves there. I'd also just point out that in Asia, we've seen a really differential impact across the region of this. In North Asia, mostly not much impact. These economies have current account surpluses, largely internal funding, not as much exposure to these global, not as much sensitivity to these global moves. In South and especially Southeast Asia, you've seen bigger responses to the global rise in yields.
Andrew, good morning. Thank you for joining in this conversation. What have you factored in on the virus front, into your economic outlook? Because we just heard from the WHO that last week, after 6 consecutive weeks of decline, cases actually ticked up globally. And so is it a clear road ahead on that front or a bumpy one? And how do you work around it?
Still a little bumpy. Asia has outperformed and been ahead in controlling the virus, but is actually behind in vaccines. What's gotten markets excited to some extent outside the region has been the rapid deployment of vaccines, particularly in the US and UK. You've had about 15% of the US population getting a shot, about 30% in the UK. So that opens up the prospect of reopening these economies relatively quickly over the next few months. And so that's good news. Now, you pointed out that in some cases you're seeing cases come back up. That's maybe a sign that in a few places restrictions are coming down too quickly. But I think the big picture is vaccinations are rolling out, virus-related restrictions are going to come down. In that respect, ironically, the US and Europe are ahead of Asia because there's been so much urgency on getting vaccines. Asian policymakers have been more conservative with restrictions, and most Asian countries have vaccinated less than 1% of the population so far, China a notable exception to that. And so it'll be more time before we see those restrictions coming off, remaining restrictions in Asia Pacific, we think.